The music had not even begun when Edmund Ashford pulled his bride away from the center of the ballroom floor. Eleanor felt his fingers close around her wrist before she understood what was happening. One moment she was standing beneath 100 candles, her white gown catching the light, waiting for the first notes of the wedding dance. The next moment she was being led, quickly and without a word of explanation, toward the side door behind the musicians. "Edmund," she whispered, trying to keep the smile on her face for the watching guests. "What is it? What's wrong?" He did not answer. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and his grip did not loosen until they were both through the door and standing alone in the cold stone corridor that ran behind the great hall. Only then did he let go of her, as though her skin had burned him. "Edmund, you're frightening me." "A carriage is being prepared," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of every warmth she had heard in it only an hour before, when he had promised, in front of a church full of witnesses, to cherish her for the rest of his life. "You will return to Ashwell Park tonight. Your maid will pack what you need." Eleanor stared at him. Surely this was some strange joke, some test of her composure that she had failed to understand. But there was nothing playful in his face. There was only a coldness she had never seen there before, not once in the 4 months of their courtship, not even in the tense weeks leading up to the wedding when his mother had objected so loudly to the match. "I don't understand," she said. "It's our wedding night." "The dance hasn't even started." "There will be no dance." "Edmund, please, tell me what has happened. Have I done something to offend you?" For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been doubt, or might have been pain. Then it was gone, replaced by the same hard composure. "I know what I know," he said quietly, "and I will not stand up in that room and dance with a woman who married me to hide her own shame." The word struck her like a slap. "Shame? What shame? I have no idea what you are speaking of." "Don't," he said, and there was something almost pleading in the single word, as though he were begging her not to make this harder than it already was. "Don't stand here and lie to me on the very night you promised never to." Before she could answer, before she could even begin to defend herself against an accusation she did not understand, a footman appeared at the end of the corridor to say the carriage was ready. Edmund did not look at her again. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom, where the orchestra had just begun to play the first dance without either the bride or the groom. Eleanor stood alone in the corridor in her wedding gown, the sound of violins drifting faintly through the walls, and understood that something had gone terribly wrong, though she could not begin to guess what it was. Her maid, a young woman named Nora who had only been with the household a few weeks, helped her into the carriage without meeting her eyes. Eleanor tried to ask her what she knew, whether she had heard anything below stairs, any rumor or whisper that might explain her husband's sudden cruelty. Nora only shook her head and busied herself with the trunk, refusing to look up. The journey to Ashwell Park, her aunt's estate, took nearly 3 hours. Eleanor spent every minute of it turning the evening over in her mind, searching for the moment things had changed. The ceremony that morning had gone perfectly. Edmund had looked at her with such open tenderness as he said his vows that several of the older women in the church had wept. The wedding breakfast afterward had been full of laughter, of toasts, of Edmund's hand resting warm and certain over hers beneath the table. Then, sometime between the breakfast and the ball, something had changed him. She thought of the letter that had arrived for him just before they left for the ballroom, delivered by a writer she did not recognize, and how he had read it standing near the window with his back to the room, his shoulders growing more rigid with every line. Whatever was written in that letter had turned her husband into a stranger within the space of an hour. Her Aunt Margaret was waiting up when the carriage arrived, still dressed for bed with a shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown, having been woken by a servant sent ahead to warn her that her niece was returning, alone, on her wedding night. Eleanor. Margaret's face went pale as she took in the sight of her niece standing on the doorstep, still in her bridal gown, her eyes red from crying in the carriage. "What has happened? Where is Edmund?" "I don't know," Eleanor said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I don't know what happened, Aunt Margaret. One moment we were married and happy, and the next he was sending me away as though I had done something unforgivable, and he wouldn't tell me what." Margaret drew her inside, out of the cold night air, and held her while she wept in a way she had not allowed herself to do in front of the servants or in the carriage. It was only once Eleanor had cried herself quiet that her aunt sat her down by the dying fire and asked, gently, whether there was anything at all, that Edmund might have heard that could have upset him so. Eleanor shook her head helplessly. She had no secrets. She had grown up in this house, under her aunt's care since her parents had died when she was 12, and her life had been quiet and unremarkable, until Edmund Ashford had noticed her at a summer gathering and begun, slowly and carefully, to court her. There had been no other suitors of consequence before him, no broken engagements, no scandal of any kind that she could imagine anyone inventing about her. "Perhaps it is a misunderstanding," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps in the morning, once he has slept, he will come to his senses and ride here himself to apologize." But morning came, and no rider appeared on the road from Camden Hall, nor did one come the next day, or the day after that. A brief note arrived a week later, written in Edmund's own hand but containing nothing of warmth or explanation. It informed her only that she would continue to receive an allowance befitting her position as his wife, that she was welcome to remain at Ashwell Park indefinitely, and that he saw no reason for further correspondence between them at present. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning, some crack in its coldness that might explain what had turned her husband against her so completely, and so suddenly. She found none. The letter was as distant and formal as one might send to a stranger. She did not write back. Pride, and a growing anger beneath her confusion, kept her from begging for an explanation she felt she did not owe. If Edmund believed some lie about her without even granting her the chance to defend herself, then perhaps he had never truly known her at all, whatever he had promised at the altar. Word of the broken wedding night spread quickly through the county, as such things always did. Neighbors called on Margaret under the pretense of concern, clearly hoping to extract some detail they could carry back to their own drawing rooms. Eleanor stopped receiving visitors after the 3rd such call, unable to bear the mixture of pity and curiosity in their eyes. She kept to the gardens instead, walking the same paths she had walked as a girl, trying to make sense of a life that had been upended in the space of a single evening. She thought often of the letter that had arrived just before the ball, of the way Edmund's face had changed as he read it, of the rider who had delivered it and vanished before anyone could ask his name or his business. Someone had told her husband a lie about her, she was certain of that much. What she could not understand was who would want to destroy her marriage before it had even properly begun, or why Edmund had believed it so completely that he had not even given her the chance to answer the accusation. As the days passed into weeks, Eleanor made a quiet decision. She would not spend her life waiting by the window for a husband who had judged her unworthy of even a simple explanation. She would build something of her own here, at Ashwell Park, away from the whispers and the pity of the county. She did not yet know what that meant, only that she refused to be the sad, discarded bride that everyone seemed to expect her to become. She had no way of knowing, as she walked the garden paths in the fading autumn light, that back at Camden Hall, her husband was beginning to have his own doubts. Nor did she know that the lie which had destroyed her wedding night had been carefully and deliberately planted by someone who stood to gain a great deal from Edmund Ashford believing his bride unworthy of him. For now there was only the silence of Ashwell Park, and the slow, painful work of learning to live with a heart that had been broken before it had ever truly begun to beat for someone else. At night, when the house had gone quiet and her aunt had retired, Eleanor would sit by her window and replay the wedding day from the beginning, searching for any clue she might have missed. She remembered the way Edmund had looked at her as she walked down the aisle, an expression so full of certainty that she had felt, for the first time in her life, entirely safe. She remembered his hand trembling slightly as he placed the ring on her finger, not from nerves, she had thought then, but from happiness. None of it matched the man who had led her from the ballroom without a backward glance. She began to wonder whether she had ever truly known him at all, or whether the version of Edmund she had fallen in love with had only ever existed in the weeks of courtship, when every word and gesture was calculated to win her affection. It was a cruel thought, and she did not want to believe it, but grief has a way of turning tenderness into suspicion when there is no explanation to hold on to instead. Margaret watched her niece grow quieter with each passing day, and worried for her in ways she did not say aloud. She had raised Eleanor since childhood, had watched her grow from a solemn, motherless girl into a woman capable of great warmth and great resilience, and she was not about to let a careless, cruel husband undo all of that in a matter of weeks. "You will not let this break you," she told Eleanor one evening, taking her niece's hands in her own. "Whatever lie he has believed, it says nothing about who you are. It says everything about him, and about whoever whispered it into his ear." Eleanor wanted to believe her. Some mornings she nearly did. But grief was patient, and it returned each night when the house grew quiet, when there was nothing left to distract her from the hollow place where her marriage should have been. She did not yet know that the answers she needed were being uncovered, slowly and carefully, many miles away, by people she had never met. 3 weeks after the wedding that never finished, a stable boy at Camden Hall found a scrap of burned letter caught in the grate of an unused fireplace. and everything Edmund Ashford believed about his marriage began, quietly, to come apart. The boy, sensible enough to know a half-burned letter was not his to read, brought it to William Hartley, the steward who had served the Ashford family for 20 years, and who Edmund trusted more than almost anyone alive. William smoothed the scorched paper against the table in his small office, and studied what remained of the handwriting. Only a few lines had survived the fire, enough to make his blood run cold. He read the words twice to be certain, then folded the fragment carefully into a handkerchief and went to find his employer. Edmund was in the study when William entered, staring at nothing in particular, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow. He had spent the past 3 weeks in much the same state, moving through his days like a man performing the motions of a life he no longer felt connected to. He had not written to Eleanor beyond the single cold note he now deeply regretted sending. He had not visited Ashwell Park. He told himself this was pride, or principle, or the natural consequence of a wife who had deceived him. In his quieter moments, alone at night, he suspected it was something closer to cowardice. "My lord," William said, and something in his tone made Edmund look up. "I believe you should see this." Edmund took the fragment and read it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful and deliberate, as though the writer had taken pains to disguise their usual hand. But the words that remained were unmistakable in their intent. They referenced a plan, a story to be told about the new bride, timed to arrive on the evening of the wedding. They mentioned a payment already made, and a second to follow once the marriage had been sufficiently damaged. Where did this come from? Edmund's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that William had not heard in years. "Found in the old fireplace in the east wing, my lord. The one your cousin has been using since his arrival." Edmund's cousin, Gerald Ashford, had been staying at Camden Hall for the better part of 2 months, ostensibly to help manage the estate accounts while Edmund settled into married life. Gerald was next in line to inherit the title and the estate should Edmund die without an heir, a fact that had never troubled Edmund until this moment, staring at proof that someone close to him had deliberately engineered the destruction of his marriage. He thought back to the letter that had arrived on his wedding night, delivered by a writer no one at the house recognized, containing claims he had never thought to question in the heat of the moment. The letter had described, in convincing detail, a secret understanding between Eleanor and a young man from a neighboring parish, a man of no fortune or standing, and suggested that Eleanor had only accepted Edmund's proposal to escape the shame of that entanglement being discovered. It had included dates, small details about Eleanor's movements that seemed impossible to invent. At the time, exhausted from the ceremony and blindsided by the accusation, Edmund had not stopped to ask himself how the letter's author could possibly know such details, unless they had been watching Eleanor closely for some time, or unless the details themselves had been carefully fabricated by someone with access to household gossip and old rumors twisted just enough to sound convincing. Now, holding proof that the entire scheme had been planned and paid for, he felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Bring me the maid," he said, "the one who traveled with Eleanor to Ashwell Park, Nora." Nora arrived within the hour, summoned from the servants' quarters where she had continued working since Eleanor's departure, too afraid to say anything that might cost her the position. When Edmund showed her the fragment of letter and asked, plainly, whether she knew anything of Gerald Ashford's dealings in the weeks before the wedding, her composure crumbled almost immediately. She confessed, through tears, that Gerald had approached her a month before the wedding, offering a sum of money larger than she would earn in 2 years of service, in exchange for small pieces of information about Eleanor's habits, her past acquaintances, the names of families she had known growing up. Nora insisted she had believed it harmless at the time, simple curiosity from a relative eager to know more about the family's newest addition. She had not known, she swore, that the information would be twisted into something so cruel, or that it would be used to destroy a marriage on its very first night. "He told me it was for a wedding gift," she said, weeping. "A history of her family, something thoughtful to present to her. I did not know, my lord. I swear before God I did not know." Edmund believed her. Nora was young and had clearly been manipulated by a man far more practiced in deception than she could have anticipated. He dismissed her from the room gently, with instructions that her position was not in danger, and turned his attention instead to the matter of his cousin. Gerald was not at Camden Hall when Edmund went looking for him. He had left that morning, he had told the housekeeper, for a brief visit to friends in the north, and was not expected to return for a fortnight. Edmund understood immediately what this meant. Someone, likely a servant loyal to Gerald rather than to the family, had warned him that the burned letter had been found, and he had fled before he could be confronted with what he had done. The rage that Edmund felt in that moment was unlike anything he had experienced before. Not only had his cousin deliberately destroyed his marriage through lies and manipulation, but Edmund himself had been so quick to believe the worst of Eleanor, so ready to condemn her without granting her even a moment to defend herself, that he had made Gerald's task almost effortless. He thought of Eleanor's face in the corridor behind the ballroom, confused and frightened, asking him again and again what she had done wrong. He thought of how he had refused to answer her, how he had turned his back on her and walked away, while the orchestra began to play without them. He had not even given her the courtesy of hearing the accusation, let alone the chance to deny it. Shame settled over him like a physical weight. He had prided himself, always, on being a fair and reasonable man, the kind of landlord who listened before he judged, the kind of friend who gave people the benefit of doubt. And yet with the one person who deserved his trust more than anyone, he had abandoned every principle he claimed to hold, all because of an unsigned letter delivered by a stranger on the most important night of their lives. William, watching his employer's face change from confusion to fury, to something that looked almost like grief, spoke carefully. "My lord, if I may, the lady deserves to know the truth, whatever it costs your pride to deliver it." "I know," Edmund said quietly. "I know that better than you can imagine." But knowing what needed to be done and finding the courage to do it were two different matters entirely. Edmund had spent 3 weeks convincing himself that Eleanor's silence, her refusal to write or plead her case, was further proof of her guilt. Now he understood it differently. She had not written because she had nothing to confess, and too much pride to beg for a fairness he had denied her. The realization made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. He spent that night awake, drafting and discarding a dozen letters, none of which seemed adequate to the task of admitting he had been wrong, that he had let a stranger's lie mean more than his own wife's character, that he had humiliated her in front of their entire wedding party over an accusation he had never bothered to investigate. In the end, he wrote nothing. Words on paper felt like a coward's apology. Another letter sent instead of a man standing before her and admitting his fault to her face. He resolved to ride to Ashwell Park himself, as soon as he had gathered proof enough to explain not just that he was sorry, but exactly how and why he had been deceived. It took him another week to track Gerald's movements, to gather statements from the writer who had delivered the false letter, a man easily found once Edmund began asking the right questions in the right taverns, and to assemble a complete account of how the deception had been planned and executed. Gerald, it emerged, had been deeply in debt for over a year, and had convinced himself that if Edmund's marriage collapsed quickly enough, before an heir could be conceived, his own path to inheriting the estate would remain clear. It was a fortnight after the burned letter had been discovered, nearly 6 weeks since the wedding, that Edmund finally felt he had gathered enough proof to face Eleanor honestly. He ordered his horse prepared at dawn, determined to ride to Ashwell Park that very day, and beg, if necessary, for the chance to explain himself. Before he left, William stopped him at the door with one final piece of caution. "My lord, forgive me for saying so, but you cannot expect her to simply forgive you because you have finally learned the truth. 6 weeks is a long time for a young woman to sit alone with humiliation. She may not receive you the way you hope." Edmund nodded slowly, the words settling over him with quiet weight. "I know I have no right to expect anything from her at all. I only want the chance to say it plainly, to her face, and let her decide what becomes of us after that." He rode out from Camden Hall as the sun was still low over the fields, his mind circling back again and again to the moment in the corridor when Eleanor had begged him to explain himself and he had said nothing. He had turned that memory over so many times in the past weeks that it had worn a groove in his thoughts, sharp and unrelenting. Along the road he stopped briefly at the tavern where he had first tracked down the rider who delivered the false letter. The man, a laborer named Peter Fenwick, had been reluctant to speak at first, fearing he would be blamed for his role in the deception, but Edmund had assured him that his honesty now would matter more than his silence. "He gave me 2 guineas to carry it and to say nothing of where it came from," Fenwick admitted, turning his cap over in his hands. "Told me the letter contained good news for the family, a wedding gift of sorts. I did not read it, my lord. I only delivered what I was told to deliver." Edmund thanked him and pressed a coin into his palm, not as payment for further silence, but as an apology for the position his cousin's scheme had placed him in. He rode on, gathering what final pieces of the story he could, determined to lay the entire truth before Eleanor, rather than a vague apology she would have every right to distrust. As he rode, he thought often of Gerald, of the resentment that must have been building in his cousin for years, hidden beneath a pleasant face and helpful manner. Edmund had never once suspected him of anything beyond mild jealousy over the family fortune, the kind of quiet envy that existed in most families, and rarely amounted to real harm. He had been wrong about that too, it seemed, just as he had been wrong about Eleanor. It struck him, riding through the cold morning air, how easily a man could believe he understood the people around him, only to discover he had barely seen them at all. He thought too of his mother, who had objected so strongly to the marriage in its early weeks, convinced that Eleanor's modest background and lack of significant fortune made her an unsuitable match for the Ashford name. His mother had softened eventually, or at least had stopped voicing her objections aloud, but Edmund now wondered whether that lingering disapproval had made him quicker to believe the worst of his bride, whether some small part of him had been waiting for proof that his mother had been right all along. The realization sat uneasily with him. He did not want to believe he had failed Eleanor, not only because of Gerald's lie, but because of doubts he had allowed to take root long before the wedding night, doubts he had never fully examined or set aside. By the time Camden Hall disappeared behind him, and the road narrowed toward the countryside where Ashwell Park stood, Edmund had resolved that whatever Eleanor decided about their future, she would at least know that he understood the full weight of what he had done, and that he did not intend to make excuses for it. He did not yet know how much had changed in the 6 weeks since he had sent her away. At Ashwell Park, Eleanor had spent the early weeks of her exile much as she had the first, walking the garden paths, avoiding visitors, allowing her aunt to fuss over her in the quiet, patient way that Margaret had always shown affection. But grief, however deep, does not remain unchanged forever, and by the 4th week, something in Eleanor had begun to shift. She stopped waiting for a letter that did not come. She stopped listening for the sound of hooves on the drive each evening. Instead, she began accompanying her aunt on visits to tenant families on the estate, rediscovering a purpose in small acts of kindness that had nothing to do with her marriage or her husband's opinion of her. She helped organize the harvest accounts, a task Margaret had struggled with alone since her own husband's passing years before, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she had a talent for it. It was during one of these visits to a tenant family that she first met Henry Colton, a gentleman farmer who had recently taken over the management of a neighboring estate for an elderly uncle in poor health. He had arrived to discuss shared boundaries and water rights with Margaret, and had stayed for tea, drawn in by conversation that was easy and unforced in a way Eleanor had not experienced in months. He did not know, at first, the details of her broken wedding night, only that she was recently married and living apart from her husband under circumstances no one seemed willing to explain. He did not ask. He spoke instead of harvest yields and difficult soil, and the small satisfactions of watching a struggling farm slowly improve under careful management, and Eleanor found herself listening with an attention she had not given anything in weeks. It was not romance, not yet. It was simply the relief of being seen as something other than a scandal, a curiosity, a woman to be pitied. Henry treated her with an easy respect that asked nothing of her and required no explanation for her circumstances, and in the weeks that followed, as he found reasons to call at Ashwell Park with increasing frequency, Eleanor began, cautiously, to let herself enjoy his company. Margaret watched this new friendship develop with a careful, hopeful eye, saying nothing to Eleanor directly but privately relieved to see color returning to her niece's face, to hear her laugh again over small things, even as the larger wound of her marriage remained unhealed beneath the surface. Eleanor did not yet know that Edmund had discovered the truth of Gerald's deception, or that her husband was, at that very moment, riding toward Ashwell Park with a heart full of regret, and a mind full of explanations he did not know how to deliver. She knew only that for the first time since her wedding night, she had begun to imagine a version of her future that did not depend entirely on whether Edmund Ashford ever came to claim her again. Edmund arrived at the gates of Ashwell Park just as the afternoon light was beginning to soften, and found himself unable to move for nearly a full minute, his horse standing patient beneath him while he stared at the house where his wife had spent 6 weeks learning to live without him. He had rehearsed his words the entire ride from Camden Hall, arranging and rearranging the explanation until it felt honest rather than rehearsed, but standing now at the gate, every carefully chosen phrase seemed to scatter from his mind at once. He dismounted, handed the reins to a groom who eyed him with open suspicion, and walked toward the house feeling more uncertain than he had felt at any point since inheriting his title. Margaret received him in the drawing room, her expression carefully neutral, though Edmund could see the effort it cost her to remain civil toward the man who had humiliated her niece in front of an entire wedding party. "She is not expecting you," Margaret said, once the formalities of greeting had been exchanged. "I am not certain she will wish to see you at all." "I understand if she doesn't," Edmund said quietly. "I only ask for the chance to tell her the truth of what happened. Whatever she decides afterward is entirely her own choice. Margaret studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the same coldness she had seen described to her in the days following the wedding. She did not find it. Instead, she saw something that looked genuinely like remorse, and after a long pause, she nodded once and went to find her niece. Eleanor was in the garden when word reached her that Edmund had arrived. She had been cutting late roses for the dinner table, and the shears stilled in her hand at the sound of her aunt's voice calling her name with an urgency that immediately told her something significant had happened. "He's here," Margaret said, coming down the garden path. "Edmund. He's asking to see you." For a moment, Eleanor felt the old ache rise in her chest, sharp and immediate, followed quickly by something colder and more guarded. 6 weeks of silence had taught her not to trust the sudden reappearance of a man who had once turned his back on her without explanation. What does he want? He says he wishes to explain everything. He seems different, Eleanor. Not at all like the man who sent you away that night. Eleanor set down her shears slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, buying herself a moment to steady her breathing before she walked back toward the house. She did not know what she expected to feel upon seeing him again. She had imagined this moment countless times in the quiet hours of her exile, had rehearsed a dozen different versions of what she might say, ranging from cold dismissal to desperate questions, and found now that none of them fit the strange, hollow calm that had settled over her. He was standing near the window when she entered the drawing room, his back to the door, much as he had been standing when the fateful letter arrived on their wedding night. The similarity was not lost on her, and she felt a fresh spike of pain at the memory. He turned when he heard her enter, and whatever composure he had gathered on the ride seemed to leave him entirely at the sight of her. "Eleanor." "Edmund." Her voice was steady, though it cost her considerable effort to keep it so. "You've come a long way to say very little, if the past 6 weeks are any indication of your intentions." He flinched at the words, though he did not argue against them. "You're right to be angry with me. I have no defense for the silence, none at all. But I am here now because I have learned the truth, and you deserve to hear it from me directly, not through another letter that offers you nothing but distance." "Then tell me," she said, folding her hands in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Tell me what could possibly have made you send me away before our first dance, without a single word of explanation." Edmund took a breath and told her everything. He told her of the letter that had arrived just before the ball, of its claims about a secret understanding with a man of no fortune, of details that had seemed too specific to be invented in the panic of the moment. He told her of the burned fragment found in the fireplace weeks later, of Nora's tearful confession, of Gerald's sudden disappearance the very morning the evidence came to light. He spared no detail, not even the ones that painted him as foolish or cowardly, determined that if she was to judge him, she would judge him on the full truth rather than a version softened to spare his pride. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face giving away little of what she felt as the story unfolded. When he finished, the drawing room fell into a silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. "So you believed a stranger's letter," she said finally, "over 4 months of knowing me. You believed it so completely that you didn't even grant me the chance to answer for myself." "Yes," Edmund said. There was no attempt to soften the admission. "I am ashamed of it, Eleanor. More ashamed than I have words to express. I told myself I was protecting the family name, protecting myself from being made a fool of, but the truth is simpler and far less flattering. I was afraid, and fear made me cruel, and I let that cruelty fall on the one person who least deserved it." "Do you have any idea," Eleanor said, her voice finally beginning to shake, "what it felt like to be led out of my own wedding ball in front of everyone we knew, and told nothing? To be sent home like a piece of unwanted luggage, and left to wonder for 6 weeks what I had done to deserve it?" "I know I cannot undo that," Edmund said. "I know 6 weeks of silence cannot be repaired with a single conversation, however honest. I am not here expecting forgiveness, Eleanor. I am here because you deserved the truth 6 weeks ago, and I am finally strong enough, or perhaps simply desperate enough, to give it to you now." Eleanor turned away from him, walking toward the window, needing a moment where he could not see her face while she gathered her thoughts. Outside, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the lawn, and she thought, unbidden, of Henry Colton, of the easy kindness he had shown her these past weeks, of how simple and undemanding his company had felt, compared to the storm that Edmund's presence had always carried with it, even in the happiest days of their courtship. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she said finally, without turning around. "You're telling me that everything, the humiliation, the silence, the months of wondering whether I had somehow imagined the marriage we built, all of it happened because you chose to believe a lie rather than trust your own wife." I'm not asking you to say anything, Edmund said. I only wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is entirely your own choice. And what of Gerald? Eleanor asked, turning back to face him. Has he been made to answer for what he did? He has fled north. For now, I have men searching for him, and I intend to see him answer fully for his deception, both to the family and to the law if it comes to that. He nearly destroyed everything, Eleanor, out of nothing more than greed and resentment he had been nursing for years. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, her anger beginning to shift, slowly and against her will, into something more complicated. She had spent 6 weeks believing herself abandoned for a reason she could not fathom, had built her understanding of her own marriage around the assumption that Edmund had simply decided, in a single evening, that she was not worth defending. Learning that his cruelty had been born of manipulation rather than genuine contempt did not erase the pain of what she had endured, but it did complicate the clean anger she had been carrying, replacing it with something messier and harder to name. I need time, she said finally. You cannot simply arrive here with the truth and expect me to fall back into your arms as though nothing happened. 6 weeks, Edmund. I have built a life here, however small, that does not depend on you. I understand, he said, and though disappointment crossed his face, there was no anger in it, only the same quiet resignation he had carried since arriving. I will not press you for more than you are willing to give. I only ask that you allow me to remain in contact, to prove through actions rather than words that I intend to be a different man than the one who failed you so completely. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of Henry, of the ring he had not yet offered but which she suspected, from the warmth in his recent visits, might not be far off. She thought of the quiet, uncomplicated peace she had found in his company, so different from the intensity, and now the guilt that radiated from the man standing before her. You may write, she said finally. I make no promises beyond that. It was not the reconciliation Edmund had hoped for, but it was more than he had believed himself entitled to when he rode through the gates that afternoon. He thanked her, quietly and without argument, and took his leave shortly after, understanding that pressing further would only harden whatever fragile opening she had just granted him. As his horse carried him back down the long drive away from Ashwell Park, Edmund found himself thinking not of relief, but of dread. Something in Eleanor's manner, a certain careful distance beneath the surface of her words, told him there was more to her new life than she had shared. He did not yet know about Henry Colton. He only knew, with the particular clarity that comes from nearly losing something precious, that he could not afford to wait much longer to win back what his own fear and pride had so nearly destroyed. Behind him, in the drawing room at Ashwell Park, Eleanor sat alone for a long while after his departure, turning the truth over in her mind, unable to decide whether the man who had just left had earned back any part of the trust he had shattered, or whether some wounds, once opened so publicly and left unattended for so long, could never fully close again. Margaret found her there an hour later, still seated by the window, the light outside now fading toward evening. She said nothing at first, simply sat beside her niece and waited, understanding from long experience that Eleanor needed silence before she could find words for what she felt. He told me everything, Eleanor said eventually. His cousin arranged the whole thing, paid for lies to be told, paid a rider to deliver them at exactly the moment they would do the most damage. Edmund believed it completely, without ever asking me a single question. And now that he knows the truth, Margaret asked gently, now he wants forgiveness. He wants to write to me, to prove himself different from the man who sent me away, as though 6 weeks of humiliation can be undone with a sincere enough letter. Can it? Eleanor did not answer right away. She thought of the ache that had lived in her chest since the wedding night, an ache that had only recently begun to soften under the warmth of new friendship and new purpose. She thought of how quickly that ache had returned the moment Edmund walked into the room, proof that whatever peace she had built for herself remained fragile, still tethered to the outcome of a marriage she had not chosen to end. I don't know, she admitted finally. Part of me wants to hate him for how easily he believed the worst of me. Another part remembers how happy I was on the morning of our wedding, before any of this happened, and wonders whether that happiness was real, or whether I simply didn't know him well enough to see what he was capable of. Perhaps both things can be true, Margaret said. He may have loved you honestly, and still failed you completely, when fear and old family doubts clouded his judgment. That does not make the failure any less real, Eleanor, but it may explain it without excusing it. Eleanor considered this for a long moment. I told him he may write, nothing more than that. I am not ready to promise anything beyond the smallest possibility that he has changed. That seems wise, Margaret said. You owe him nothing more than that, whatever guilt he carries. Over the following days, Eleanor found her thoughts circling constantly between the two men who now occupied such different corners of her heart. Henry called at Ashwell Park 2 days after Edmund's visit, unaware of what had transpired, and Eleanor found herself studying him with new attention, comparing the steadiness of his presence to the storm that always seemed to follow in Edmund's wake. Henry noticed a change in her manner immediately, though he was too considerate to press her on its cause. "You seem troubled," he said, as they walked the garden paths together, the late roses now beginning to fade with the turning season. "If there is anything I can do, you need only ask." "My husband came to see me," Eleanor said, deciding that honesty, however uncomfortable, was owed to a man who had shown her nothing but patience these past weeks. "He explained the reason he sent me away. It was not what I believed. Someone deceived him, deliberately, in order to destroy our marriage before it could properly begin." Henry was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And do you believe him?" "I believe the evidence he showed me. I am less certain what to believe about the man himself, or whether I can trust him not to be so easily turned against me again, should someone else decide to try." "That seems a reasonable doubt to hold," Henry said carefully. "Trust, once broken so publicly, is not easily rebuilt, whatever the explanation offered for the breaking." Eleanor appreciated, more than she could say, that he did not press her further, did not ask what this meant, for whatever understanding had begun quietly growing between them. He simply continued the walk beside her, offering the same steady, undemanding companionship he always had, and Eleanor found herself grateful, in that moment, for a man who asked so little while giving so much. Meanwhile, at Camden Hall, Edmund threw himself into the search for Gerald with an intensity that surprised even William. Reports eventually placed his cousin in a coastal town nearly 100 miles north, living under a different name and evidently preparing to take passage abroad before his debts and his scheme could catch up with him entirely. Edmund rode north himself, unwilling to trust the matter to hired men alone, determined to see his cousin face the consequences of what he had done. The confrontation, when it finally came, was brief and without violence, Gerald offering little resistance once he understood that Edmund possessed proof enough to ruin him regardless of whether he confessed. "You had everything," Edmund said, staring at the cousin he had once considered a friend as much as family. "A comfortable life, a place in this family that no one questioned. Why destroy it all over a title you were never guaranteed to inherit, even if you had succeeded?" Gerald's answer, when it came, was bitter and unrepentant. He spoke of years spent watching Edmund inherit everything of consequence while he himself received only scraps of family generosity, of debts that had grown unmanageable, of a desperation that had curdled slowly into resentment, until destroying Edmund's happiness had come to feel, in his own twisted reasoning, like justice rather than cruelty. Edmund left him to the authorities that had been summoned to meet them, feeling no satisfaction in his cousin's downfall, only a weary sadness at how much damage jealousy and unspoken grievance had been allowed to cause before anyone had noticed the danger it posed. He rode back toward Camden Hall with Gerald's confession secured, the last piece of proof he needed to demonstrate fully, beyond any possible doubt, that Eleanor had been entirely innocent of the accusations that had ended their wedding night so cruelly. It was a small comfort, knowing the truth had finally, completely surfaced. It did nothing to ease the deeper fear that had settled over him since leaving Ashwell Park, the growing certainty that he had returned to claim his wife's trust far too late to matter. The ring caught the candlelight as Henry knelt beside her in the small parlor at Ashwell Park, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, not with the joy she had once imagined such a moment would bring, but with a confusion so sharp it nearly stole her voice entirely. It had been 6 weeks since Edmund's visit, and true to his word, he had written to her regularly, careful letters that spoke of small matters at Camden Hall, of Gerald's eventual arrest and confession, of the slow work of repairing what his cousin's scheme had damaged within the household and the family's reputation. The letters never pressed her for more than she was willing to give, never demanded forgiveness or declared some grand renewal of feeling. They simply arrived, week after week, steady and patient, a quiet thread connecting her to a marriage she had still not decided whether to reclaim. In that same span of weeks, Henry had continued his own quiet courtship, arriving with fresh flowers or interesting news from the neighboring farms, sitting with her through long afternoons that asked nothing of her beyond her company. Where Edmund's letters stirred a complicated ache of old love and lingering hurt, Henry's presence offered something simpler: safety, certainty, a future that did not depend on whether a man could learn to trust his own wife. "Eleanor," Henry said now, his voice steady despite the visible nerves in his hands as he held the small ring toward her. "I know your circumstances are unusual, And I know you carry a history that is not yet fully resolved. I do not ask you to pretend otherwise. I only ask whether you would consider building a future with me, whatever shape that future must take." Eleanor stared at the ring, then at Henry's earnest, hopeful face, and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her from every direction at once. She was, in the strictest sense, still married. An annulment or separation would need to be pursued, a complicated and public process that would only feed the gossip that had already followed her since her wedding night. And yet the man in front of her offered something she had not felt in months, not since long before the wedding itself. Peace. "Henry," she said carefully, "you understand that my marriage is not yet resolved. I do not know what the law would require, or how long such matters take to settle." "I understand," he said. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Eleanor. I am asking whether you would accept my intention, my promise, that when you are free to choose, I would be honored if you chose me." Eleanor looked at the ring for a long moment, thinking of Edmund's letters sitting in the drawer of her writing desk, of the careful, patient words that never once demanded anything of her, and of the strange, unresolved ache that still lived in her chest whenever she thought of him. She thought too of the humiliation of her wedding night, of 6 weeks of silence that had taught her not to place her trust so easily in promises of change. Henry had never once made her doubt him. He had never once caused her a single moment of the pain Edmund's rejection had caused. "Yes," she said finally, and though her voice was steady, something inside her felt strangely hollow as she spoke the word, as though she were accepting a comfort rather than embracing a joy. "Yes, Henry, I accept." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, watching his face light with genuine happiness, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something close to contentment. It was not the overwhelming certainty she had felt on her wedding morning with Edmund, but perhaps, she told herself, that kind of certainty had only ever led to heartbreak. Perhaps a quieter, steadier kind of affection was worth more in the end than the intensity she had once mistaken for lasting love. Margaret, when told the news that evening, received it with careful diplomacy, though Eleanor could see the concern beneath her aunt's polite congratulations. "Are you certain, Eleanor?" Margaret asked, once they were alone. "You are still married, whatever distance now sits between you and Edmund. An engagement under these circumstances will not go unnoticed, nor will it be simple to untangle." "I am aware of the difficulty," Eleanor said, "but I cannot spend the rest of my life waiting to see whether Edmund proves himself trustworthy, Aunt Margaret. Henry offers me certainty. I think, after everything, I have earned the right to choose certainty over uncertainty, whatever the law makes of it." Margaret did not argue further, though privately she wondered whether her niece had chosen Henry out of genuine affection, or out of exhaustion with the pain that loving Edmund had brought her. She kept this doubt to herself, unwilling to add further weight to a decision Eleanor had clearly already wrestled with at length. News of the engagement, discreet as they tried to keep it, spread through the county within days, as such things always did. It reached Camden Hall nearly a week later, carried by a distant cousin who had heard the rumor at a dinner party and repeated it, without any particular malice, to a member of Edmund's household staff, who then, out of loyalty rather than gossip, felt obligated to inform her employer directly. Edmund received the news standing in the same study where he had first learned of Gerald's betrayal, and felt something inside him go still and cold, in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of the night he had sent Eleanor away. "Are you certain of this?" he asked William, who had been the one to deliver the report, his own face carefully neutral. "I am afraid so, my lord. A gentleman farmer, a Mr. Henry Colton, has been courting her these several months, since not long after her return to Ashwell Park. The engagement is not yet formally announced, but it is understood among the household there that a ring has been given and accepted." Edmund sat heavily in his chair, the letters he had been drafting to Eleanor that very morning suddenly feeling foolish and inadequate, mere words against the reality of another man's ring on his wife's finger. He thought of his own letters, careful and patient, never once daring to ask for more than she was willing to give, and understood now, with painful clarity, that his caution had cost him the very thing he had been trying so carefully to protect. "I should have gone to her again," he said quietly, more to himself than to William. "I should have pressed my case rather than waiting patiently for her to come around in her own time. I gave another man the chance to win what should have always been mine to keep." "With respect, my lord," William said carefully, "you cannot know that pressing harder would have changed her mind. The lady endured a humiliation few would forgive easily, whatever the explanation offered afterward. Perhaps this Mr. Colton simply offered her something you, in your current circumstances, could not. And what is that? Certainty, my lord. A man who never once made her doubt his intentions." The words struck Edmund harder than he expected. He had spent the past 2 months trying to prove, through patience and careful restraint, that he had changed, that he could be trusted not to repeat the cruelty of the wedding night. But patience, he now understood, could look very much like distance to a woman who had already been abandoned once without warning. He had been so careful not to press her, not to overwhelm her with demands she was not ready to meet, that he had left an opening wide enough for another man to walk through entirely. He spent that night in much the same state he had spent the night after discovering Gerald's fireplace, awake and turning the situation over from every possible angle, searching for some path forward that did not simply mean accepting his own marriage's quiet dissolution. He was still, technically, her husband. The law would not easily grant an annulment or separation, particularly not one contested by the husband himself, and Edmund found himself, for the first time since sending Eleanor away, genuinely willing to contest whatever legal proceedings might follow, whatever the cost to his pride or his public reputation. By morning, he had made his decision. He would ride to Ashwell Park once more, not with careful letters and patient distance, but with the full truth of his feelings laid bare, whatever the risk of rejection. He had spent 2 months protecting himself from the possibility of being refused a second time. He understood now that such caution had already cost him nearly everything that mattered. He ordered his horse prepared at first light, and this time, he did not spend the ride rehearsing careful, measured words. He rode with a single, clear purpose fixed in his mind. He would not let his wife marry another man without first knowing, beyond any possible doubt, exactly how deeply and completely he still loved her. He did not know, riding toward Ashwell Park in the pale morning light, that Eleanor herself had spent the same sleepless night staring at the ring on her finger, wondering, in the quiet privacy of her own room, why accepting Henry's proposal had brought her comfort, rather than the joy she had always imagined such a moment should bring. In truth, Eleanor had barely slept at all. She had lain awake long after the candle had burned low, turning her hand this way and that so the small ring caught what little light remained, trying to summon the certainty she had felt when she accepted it. Instead, she found herself remembering, unbidden, the weight of a different ring being placed on her finger months earlier, in a church full of witnesses, by a man whose eyes had shone with a devotion she had never once doubted, not until the moment he led her from the ballroom without explanation. She rose before dawn, unable to lie still any longer, and walked down to the kitchen garden, where the household staff had not yet begun their morning work. The air was cold and sharp, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as she walked the familiar rows of herbs and vegetables that had, over the past months, become as much her responsibility as her aunt's. She thought about what Margaret had asked her, gently, the night before, whether she was certain. She had answered with confidence at the time, but standing alone in the gray morning light, the confidence felt thinner than it had the evening before, worn away by hours of quiet reflection she had not been able to escape. She loved Henry, she told herself, not with the consuming, breathless intensity she had once felt for Edmund, but with something calmer, something that asked less of her and therefore, she reasoned, demanded less risk in return. Surely that was wisdom rather than settling. Surely a woman who had been so thoroughly humiliated by passionate love was entitled to choose safety instead, without that choice being mistaken for a lesser kind of happiness. And yet the thought did not sit easily. She found herself, more often than she wished to admit, rereading Edmund's letters after Henry had gone home for the evening, searching each one for some sign of the man she had married, some proof that his patience these past months had been genuine, rather than merely another performance calculated to win her back. She had found, each time, nothing but sincerity in his words, careful and unhurried, never once demanding forgiveness he had not yet earned. It troubled her, this quiet habit of hers, this inability to fully close the door on a marriage that had caused her so much pain. She told herself it was simply the natural difficulty of ending something so significant, that any woman in her position would feel a similar pull toward unfinished business, regardless of whether that business still held any real hope of resolution. By the time the sun had fully risen and the household began to stir around her, Eleanor had convinced herself, or nearly convinced herself, that her hesitation was nothing more than the ordinary ache of closing one chapter before beginning another. She returned to the house, washed the cold from her hands, and prepared to face the day as an engaged woman, determined to give Henry the full and undivided affection he deserved. She did not yet know that her husband was already several hours into his ride toward Ashwell Park, driven by a resolve stronger than any he had shown in the 2 careful, patient months since his last visit. Nor did she know that the quiet, unresolved ache she had spent the morning trying to dismiss as ordinary grief was, in fact, the truest signal her heart had offered her since the wedding night, one she had simply not yet allowed herself to fully hear. Henry arrived at midday, as he often did, carrying a small bundle of late autumn flowers and a warmth in his expression that had not wavered once since the evening he proposed. He found Eleanor in the drawing room, seated near the window with a piece of needlework she had not touched in nearly an hour, her thoughts clearly occupied elsewhere. "You seem distracted today," he observed, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent many afternoons in that very room. "Is something troubling you?" Eleanor considered deflecting the question, offering some small excuse about a restless night or a minor household concern. But something in Henry's steady, patient gaze made her hesitate, made her wonder whether he deserved better than the careful half-truths she had been offering everyone, including herself, since accepting his proposal. "I find myself thinking of Edmund more than I expected to, given our engagement," she admitted finally, watching his face carefully for any sign of hurt or anger. "I do not say this to cause you pain, Henry. I say it because you deserve honesty, and I am not certain I have been entirely honest with myself these past weeks." Henry was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. When he spoke, his voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of resigned understanding that made Eleanor's chest ache with guilt. "I suspected as much," he said. "I have watched you read his letters, Eleanor, watched the way your expression changes when his name is mentioned. I told myself it was simply the natural residue of a marriage not yet fully ended, but I think, perhaps, it is something more than residue." "I don't know what it is," Eleanor said honestly. "I only know that I do not wish to build a life with you while some part of my heart remains uncertain of what it wants. You deserve better than that, Henry, far better." He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand gently, the ring catching the afternoon light between them. "Then perhaps," he said, with a gentleness that only deepened her guilt, "we should not rush toward a wedding while that uncertainty remains. I would rather wait and know your heart is fully mine than hold a ring that was given out of exhaustion rather than true feeling." Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly at his words, moved by a kindness she felt she did not entirely deserve. She did not yet know that within the hour, the very uncertainty they were discussing would arrive at the front gate of Ashwell Park in the form of her husband, determined at last to fight for the marriage he had so nearly let slip away. Edmund's horse had barely come to a stop at the gate before he was dismounting, moving with a haste that startled the groom who came to take the reins, and by the time he reached the front door of Ashwell Park, his heart was pounding with something far more urgent than the exertion of the ride. He found Margaret in the entrance hall, clearly having heard his arrival, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Edmund, we were not expecting you. I need to see her, Margaret. Please. I know I have no right to arrive unannounced, but I cannot wait any longer to say what needs to be said." Margaret studied him for a long moment, taking in the urgency in his face, so different from the careful, measured composure he had shown on his previous visit. "She is in the drawing room," she said finally, "with Mr. Colton." The name landed like a blow, though Edmund had known, riding here, that he might arrive to find exactly this. He nodded once, steadying himself, and walked toward the drawing room with a determination that did not waver even as his mind raced with everything he might say, everything he needed her to understand. He did not wait to be announced. He opened the door himself, and the sight that greeted him, Eleanor seated close to another man, her hand resting in his, sent a fresh wave of pain through him, so sharp it nearly stole his voice entirely. Both Eleanor and Henry looked up at his sudden entrance, startled into silence. For a long moment no one spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to feel. "Edmund," Eleanor said finally, rising from her seat, her hand slipping free of Henry's. "What are you doing here?" "I could not stay away," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I heard of your engagement, and I could not simply accept it without telling you, plainly, and without careful restraint this time, exactly what I feel." Henry rose as well, his expression carefully composed despite the obvious tension of the moment. "Perhaps I should give you both a moment," he said quietly, moving toward the door. "No," Eleanor said quickly, surprising both men. "Stay, Henry. Whatever Edmund has to say, he may say it in front of both of us." Edmund hesitated, caught off guard by this, but understood, looking at her steady expression, that she meant it as a test as much as a request. If his feelings were genuine, they would withstand being spoken honestly regardless of who was present to hear them. "Very well," he said, and turned to face her fully, ignoring Henry's presence as best he could. "Eleanor, I have spent 2 months writing you careful letters, never once pressing you for more than you seemed willing to give, because I told myself that patience was the proof you needed of my changed character. I see now that my patience looked, to you, very much like distance, like a man who had not truly fought for what he wanted. "Edmund, let me finish," he said, gently but firmly. "I do not blame you for accepting Mr. Colton's proposal. You deserved certainty after everything I put you through, and he has clearly offered you exactly that, steadily and without the storm that seems to follow me wherever I go. But I cannot stand by and watch you marry another man while the truth remains unspoken between us. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since long before our wedding night, and I have not stopped loving you for a single day since sending you away, however poorly that love was expressed in my actions." The room fell silent. Eleanor stood very still, her eyes moving between Edmund's face, raw with an honesty she had not seen from him even during his last visit, and Henry, who watched the exchange with quiet, careful dignity, offering no objection though his jaw was tightly set. "You cannot simply arrive here," Eleanor said finally, "and undo 2 months of careful distance with a single declaration. Edmund, do you understand what it cost me to accept Henry's proposal? To finally begin building a life that did not depend on whether you would ever fully trust me again." "I understand," Edmund said. "I understand better than you know, because I have spent these past weeks watching my own caution cost me the very thing I was trying to protect. I am not asking you to abandon Mr. Colton on the spot, Eleanor. I am asking you to consider, honestly, whether the peace you have found with him is the same as what we once had, or whether it is simply the absence of pain, mistaken for happiness because pain was all you had known from me for so long." The words struck something in Eleanor that she had been trying, for weeks, not to examine too closely. She thought of the previous afternoon, of Henry's gentle admission that he had noticed her reading Edmund's letters with an attention that went beyond mere curiosity, of her own tearful confession that some part of her heart remained uncertain, even as she wore another man's ring. "That is unfair," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "You cannot accuse me of settling simply because I chose the man who never once made me question his intentions." "I am not accusing you of anything," Edmund said. "I am only asking you to be as honest with yourself as I have finally learned to be with you. Do you love him, Eleanor? Truly, completely, the way you once loved me?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, the words refusing to come as easily as she wanted them to. Henry, watching this hesitation, felt something in his chest tighten with a sad, quiet understanding that confirmed what he had already begun to suspect the day before. "Eleanor," he said gently, drawing her attention back to him, "you do not need to answer him, but perhaps you should answer yourself." She turned to look at him, guilt written plainly across her face. "Henry, I told you yesterday," he said, with a gentleness that made the moment somehow harder rather than easier, "that I would rather know your heart was fully mine than hold a ring given out of exhaustion. I think, watching you now, I have my answer, even if you have not yet found the words for it yourself." "That isn't fair to you," Eleanor said, tears rising in her eyes. "You have done nothing but treat me with kindness since the day we met. You deserve so much more than being cast aside because my own heart cannot let go of a man who once humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. I deserve a wife who loves me without reservation," Henry said simply, "not a woman who is grateful for my kindness while her heart still belongs, however unwillingly, to someone else. I would rather release you now, with whatever dignity remains to us both, than watch you spend a lifetime wondering what might have been." He crossed the room and gently removed the ring from her hand, not with anger, but with a quiet resignation that spoke of a man who had, in truth, expected this outcome from the moment Edmund walked through the door. "I wish you happiness, Eleanor," he said, closing his hand around the small ring. "Truly, whatever form that happiness ultimately takes. And you," he added, turning to Edmund with a steady, unflinching gaze, "had better prove worthy of a second chance. You very nearly did not receive it all." He left the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the hall and then out through the front door, leaving Eleanor and Edmund alone in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, entirely honest. "I never intended for it to happen this way," Eleanor said quietly, once Henry's carriage could be heard departing down the drive. "I never meant to hurt him." "I know," Edmund said, "and I am sorry for the pain this has caused everyone involved, including him. But Eleanor, I cannot pretend I am sorry that you are no longer engaged to another man. I have spent these past months learning what it feels like to lose you slowly, through my own cowardice and hesitation, and I do not intend to make that mistake again." Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the afternoon's events. "I don't know if I can simply forget what happened, Edmund. The wedding night, the 6 weeks of silence, Those wounds do not disappear simply because Henry is gone, and you have finally found the courage to speak plainly. I don't expect you to forget, Edmund said, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. I only ask for the chance to prove, through years of patience and honesty, if that is what it takes, that the man who sent you away that night is not the man I intend to remain. I was wrong to doubt you. I was wrong to let fear and old family prejudice cloud my judgment on the most important night of our lives. I cannot undo that, but I can spend every day going forward proving that I have learned from it. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for the same certainty she had once felt so easily on her wedding morning, before any of this had happened. She did not find that same simple certainty. What she found instead was something more complicated, a fragile hope tempered by hard-won caution, but real nonetheless, and perhaps, she thought, more honest than the untested devotion she had once felt. I need time, she said finally, echoing the words she had spoken to him during his first visit. But this time, Edmund, I want you to stay near enough that we can rebuild something slowly, together, rather than exchanging careful letters from a distance that only made both of us doubt what remained between us. Whatever you need, he said, I will not make the mistake of retreating again. It was not the sweeping reconciliation of a fairy tale, not yet, but it was a beginning built on honesty rather than assumption. And as Edmund took her hand gently in his own, both of them understood that the hardest, most important work of repairing their marriage was only just beginning. Margaret, who had remained discreetly in the hallway during much of the exchange, entered the drawing room once she judged enough time had passed, carrying a tea tray more out of habit than genuine purpose. She took in the scene before her, Eleanor still seated, Edmund kneeling close beside her, and felt a cautious relief settle over her, tempered by the knowledge that reconciliation, however hopeful its beginning, would require far more than a single honest conversation to fully take root. I take it Mr. Colton has departed, she said carefully, setting down the tray. He has, Eleanor said, her voice still unsteady. I am afraid I have caused him a great deal of pain today, Aunt Margaret. However gently he chose to bear it. He is a good man, Margaret said. Good men understand, even when it costs them, that a heart cannot be commanded into loving where it does not. He will recover, in time, and find a woman whose affection is not divided as yours has clearly been these past weeks. Eleanor accepted this with a small, sad nod, grateful that her aunt did not press further into the guilt she already carried heavily enough on her own. Edmund rose from where he had been kneeling and, at Margaret's gentle but pointed suggestion, agreed to stay at a nearby inn rather than return immediately to Camden Hall, so that he and Eleanor might continue their conversation over the following days, without the pressure of an immediate parting hanging over every word. It was, Margaret explained privately to her niece later that evening, the wisest course. Trust rebuilt in a single afternoon was trust likely to crumble again at the first difficulty. What Eleanor and Edmund needed now was time spent honestly in each other's company, without the extremes of either complete separation or immediate, unexamined reunion. Over the following week, Edmund called at Ashwell Park each day, and slowly, carefully, the two of them began the work of relearning each other. They spoke of small things at first, deliberately avoiding the heavier subjects that had brought them to this point, content simply to walk the garden paths together, as they had done in the early days of their courtship, before any of the pain had entered their story. It was on the fourth day that Eleanor finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of her mind since his first visit. Edmund, why did you believe the letter so completely? We had known each other for months. You had seen nothing in my character to suggest such deception was possible. Why did a single unsigned letter, delivered by a stranger, undo all of that in a single evening? Edmund was quiet for a long while as they walked, clearly weighing how honestly he wished to answer. I have asked myself the same question many times since, he said finally. I think, if I am entirely truthful, it was never really about you at all. My mother had voiced doubts about our match from the very beginning, doubts about your modest fortune, about whether a marriage built more on affection than advantageous connection could truly last within a family like mine. I told myself I had dismissed those doubts entirely, but some small, unexamined part of me had clearly not. When the letter arrived, it did not create suspicion out of nothing. It found a small crack that was already there, one I had never bothered to look at closely enough to seal properly. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, appreciating the honesty even as it stung to hear. So even without Gerald's scheme, some part of you might have doubted me eventually. Perhaps, Edmund admitted, which is why I do not simply want to promise you that I have learned to trust you completely, as though trust were a single lesson learned once and never questioned again. I want to show you, through years if necessary, that whatever doubts my family or my own insecurities might raise, I choose you, deliberately and repeatedly, over any inherited prejudice about fortune or family standing. It was, Eleanor thought, a more honest answer than she had expected, and a far more useful one than empty reassurance would have been. She found herself, in the days that followed, watching him with new attention, looking not for grand declarations but for the smaller, steadier proofs of character he had promised, the kind that could only be demonstrated over time, rather than in a single afternoon's confession. Word of the broken engagement with Henry Colton spread through the county nearly as quickly as news of the original wedding night scandal had, and Eleanor found herself once again the subject of considerable gossip, though this time she found she cared far less for the opinions of neighbors who knew nothing of the truth behind either event. She had spent months allowing the county's whispers to shape her sense of her own worth, and she found, with some surprise, that she no longer had the patience for it. Henry, for his part, sent a single brief letter a week after their parting, wishing her well and expressing, with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout, his hope that she would find lasting happiness with the husband she had ultimately chosen. Eleanor read the letter with tears in her eyes, grateful beyond words for the grace with which he had released her, and wrote back a heartfelt reply thanking him for a kindness she knew she did not entirely deserve. As the weeks passed, Edmund's visits continued, steady and unhurried, each one adding another small brick to the foundation they were slowly rebuilding. He told her more of Gerald's fate, of the trial that awaited his cousin for both the deception and the debts that had driven him to it, and of the quiet, difficult conversations he had begun having with his mother about the assumptions she had allowed to take root in both their minds regarding Eleanor's suitability as his wife. "She has agreed to receive you properly when you are ready," Edmund told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden where roses had once bloomed and now stood bare, waiting for the coming spring. "Not because I demanded it, though I would have, but because I think, in her own way, she has begun to understand how much damage her doubts contributed to what happened between us." Eleanor was not certain she was ready to forgive Edmund's mother so easily, but she appreciated the gesture, and the acknowledgement that the coldness she had once felt from that quarter of the family had not gone unnoticed or unaddressed. By the time winter began to settle fully over the county, something had shifted quietly between Eleanor and Edmund, not the sudden, overwhelming certainty of their courtship months earlier, but a steadier, more deliberate kind of trust, built brick by brick through honest conversation and consistent presence rather than grand romantic gestures. It was, Eleanor found, a different kind of love than the one she had felt on her wedding morning, but perhaps, she allowed herself to think, a more durable one, tested now by fire and found, slowly and carefully, to still be standing. A single carriage stood waiting at the gates of Camden Hall on a cold morning in early spring, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding as fiercely as it had on the day of her original wedding, though for entirely different reasons this time. 6 months had passed since Henry Colton had walked out of Ashwell Park with quiet dignity, and in those months, Eleanor and Edmund had done the slow, careful work of rebuilding something that had once seemed beyond repair. Edmund's visits had continued through the darkest months of winter, each one steady and unhurried, and by the time the first signs of spring began appearing in the hedgerows, Eleanor had found herself, almost without noticing the exact moment it happened, fully and completely in love with her husband once more. But love, she had learned through painful experience, was not enough on its own. She had told Edmund as much during one of their long walks in late winter, and he had listened without argument, understanding immediately what she meant. "I do not simply want to return to Camden Hall as though nothing happened," she had said. "I do not want a quiet resumption of our marriage, tucked away from public view as though I should be ashamed of what occurred, or as though we are simply pretending our wedding night never happened at all. If we are to begin again, Edmund, I want it done properly, publicly, in front of the very people who watched you send me away." Edmund had agreed without hesitation, and it was this agreement that had brought them, 6 months later, to the morning of a second wedding celebration, one that would finish exactly where the first had left off, with the dance that had never taken place. The morning had been full of quiet preparation. Eleanor had chosen a gown of deep blue rather than the white she had worn the first time, wanting this occasion to feel distinctly its own rather than a simple repetition of what had come before. Margaret had helped her dress, her hands steadied despite the tears that kept threatening at the corners of her eyes throughout the morning. "You look radiant," Margaret said, adjusting a final pin in Eleanor's hair. "Far more radiant than you did the first time, if I am honest. There is a certainty in your face now that was not there before, whatever storms it took to earn it." "I feel it," Eleanor admitted. "It is a different feeling than I had on my first wedding morning. That certainty was untested, easy, born of a courtship that had never faced any real difficulty. This feels earned somehow, harder won, and because of that, I think, more solid. Edmund had spent the same morning at Camden Hall undergoing his own quiet transformation, having spent the previous evening in a long conversation with his mother, who had finally, fully acknowledged the role her early doubts had played in the disaster of the original wedding night. Their relationship remained complicated, layered with old tensions that would not disappear overnight, but she had agreed, without reservation this time, to stand beside her son and welcome Eleanor properly into the family, in front of the entire county if necessary, as proof of how completely her opinion had changed. Gerald's trial had concluded some months earlier, resulting in a lengthy sentence that had removed him entirely from the county and from any further claim on the Ashford inheritance. His downfall had been, in its own way, a final piece of closure for both Eleanor and Edmund, proof beyond any lingering doubt that the deception which had nearly destroyed their marriage had been the product of one man's greed and resentment rather than any true failing on Eleanor's part. The ceremony itself, held in the same church where their original vows had been spoken, was smaller than the first, attended only by close family and the handful of neighbors and tenants who had shown genuine kindness to Eleanor during her months of exile at Ashwell Park. William stood near the front, having played such a quiet but crucial role in uncovering the truth that Edmund had insisted he be present as something closer to family than servant. Even Nora, the young maid whose small deception had been so thoroughly exploited by Gerald, attended at Eleanor's own invitation, a gesture of forgiveness that moved the young woman to tears. Eleanor walked down the aisle toward Edmund with a steadiness that surprised even herself, watching his face as she approached, searching for and finding the same open, certain devotion she had seen on their first wedding morning, though tempered now with something deeper, something that had been tested by real difficulty and had proven, ultimately, unbreakable. "I promise," Edmund said, when it came time for him to speak his vows, departing slightly from the traditional words to add something of his own, "not simply to love you, Eleanor, but to trust you completely, even when doubt whispers in my ear from voices I have known my whole life. I promise to choose you, deliberately, every single day, rather than assuming that choice was made once and requires no further tending. I failed to keep that promise once, at great cost to us both. I will not fail again." Eleanor felt tears rise as she listened, understanding the full weight of what those words cost a proud man to admit publicly, in front of family and neighbors who had witnessed his original failure so clearly. When it came her turn to speak, she found her own voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. "I promise to trust the man standing before me today," she said, "not the man who once doubted me without cause, but the one who has spent 6 months proving, through patience and honesty, that he has learned from that failure. I promise to remember that love without communication nearly destroyed us once, and I will not let silence or pride stand between us again, whatever difficulties we may face." The ceremony concluded with none of the pomp or scale of the original wedding, but with a depth of feeling that had been entirely absent the first time, buried as it had been beneath social expectation and the excitement of a match that everyone had agreed was advantageous without anyone truly examining whether it was built to last. The celebration that followed was held in the Great Hall at Camden Hall, the very room where the original wedding ball had been cut short before it had properly begun. Eleanor felt a flicker of old anxiety as she entered the room, memories of that terrible night rising unbidden, the cold grip of Edmund's hand on her wrist, the confusion and humiliation of being led away in front of everyone she knew. Edmund seemed to sense her hesitation and took her hand gently, not with the urgent, cold grip of that first night, but with a warmth that immediately began to ease the old tension in her chest. "This room holds a painful memory for us both," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I thought, tonight, we might give it a better one to remember instead." The orchestra, the same musicians who had begun playing the first dance to an empty floor 6 months earlier, struck up a familiar melody as the guests gathered around the edges of the room, watching with quiet anticipation. Edmund led Eleanor to the center of the floor, exactly where they had stood on their original wedding night, exactly where he had pulled her away before the music could even properly begin. This time, he did not let go of her hand. They began to dance, slowly at first, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room watching them, felt the weight of the county's collective memory of that first terrible night pressing in around them. But as the music continued, as Edmund's hand remained steady at her waist and his eyes remained fixed on hers with a devotion that asked nothing of the room's judgment, she found the old anxiety slowly melting away, replaced by something warm and certain and entirely her own. "I owe you this dance," Edmund said quietly, as they turned slowly across the floor. "I owed it to you 6 months ago, and I have thought of little else since the night I failed to give it to you. You owe me a great deal more than a single dance, Eleanor said, though there was no bitterness left in the words, only a gentle teasing that made Edmund's answering smile widen with genuine relief. But I suppose this is a fine place to begin repaying the debt. Then let me begin properly, he said, and drew her slightly closer as the music swelled around them, the entire room watching a marriage that had nearly been destroyed finding at last its true beginning. Margaret watched from the edge of the room with tears openly falling now, remembering the broken young woman who had arrived at Ashwell Park in a wedding gown 6 months earlier, unable to understand what she had done to deserve such cruelty. She thought of the long months of quiet grief that had followed, of the slow, careful rebuilding that had brought them to this moment, and felt a deep, grateful relief that her niece had found her way, finally, to a happiness that felt earned rather than assumed. William, standing nearby, allowed himself a rare smile as he watched his employer dance with the wife he had so nearly lost through his own fear and pride. He thought of the burned fragment of letter he had found in the fireplace so many months ago, of how close the truth had come to remaining buried forever beneath Gerald's careful deception, and felt grateful, in his own quiet way, that fate had allowed the truth to surface before it was entirely too late. As the dance continued, the guests began to join them on the floor, the great hall filling slowly with music and movement, and the particular joy of a room finally getting to witness the celebration it had been denied 6 months earlier. Eleanor, held securely in her husband's arms, felt for the first time since her wedding night a complete and settled peace, the kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having faced that difficulty honestly and emerged, together, on the other side of it. "I love you," Edmund murmured, close enough that only she could hear the words. "Not the idea of you, not the advantageous match my family once weighed so carefully, but you, exactly as you are, with all the strength you showed in surviving what I put you through." "I love you too," Eleanor answered, and found, saying the words, that they carried a depth and certainty that the same words had never quite held on her original wedding day, tested now by fire and proven true. Even after everything, Edmund, perhaps especially after everything. Later in the evening, as the more formal dancing gave way to lighter conversation and the guests began mingling freely across the great hall, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with Edmund's mother, who approached her with a careful, deliberate humility that Eleanor had not expected to see so soon. "I owe you an apology," the older woman said, without preamble, her hands folded tightly in front of her, as though bracing herself for the conversation. "A far greater one than I have offered so far. My doubts about your suitability for this family were unfounded, and worse, they left a crack in my son's judgment that a determined, cruel man was able to exploit at the worst possible moment. I will not pretend the months since have been easy for either of us, but I hope, in time, you will allow me to earn back whatever trust I forfeited through my own foolishness." Eleanor studied her mother-in-law's face, searching for any trace of the cold disapproval she remembered from the early days of her courtship with Edmund, and found instead something that looked genuinely like remorse. "I appreciate you saying so," she said carefully. "I cannot promise instant forgiveness, but I am willing to build something new between us, the same way Edmund and I have had to build something new for ourselves these past months." "That is more grace than I likely deserve," the older woman said, "but I am grateful for it nonetheless." The conversation eased something in Eleanor that she had not fully realized was still tense, a final piece of the old wound beginning, slowly, to close alongside the others. She returned to Edmund's side feeling lighter than she had all evening, and he seemed to sense the shift immediately, though he did not ask what had passed between her and his mother, simply drawing her close again with the quiet, attentive warmth that had become so familiar over the past months. As the evening wore on, William approached the couple with a small, wrapped parcel, offering it to Edmund with the same steady loyalty he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "A small gift, my lord, from the household staff. We thought it fitting, given the circumstances." Edmund unwrapped it to find a simple silver frame, empty but for a small inscription along the bottom edge, reading only the date of their original wedding and the date of this second, truer celebration, joined together, as though marking not two separate events but a single, continuous story that had simply taken an unexpected and painful detour before finding its way home. "We thought you might wish to place a portrait within it," William explained, "once one has been properly commissioned, a reminder perhaps of how far the both of you have come." Eleanor felt tears rise again at the thoughtfulness of the gesture, touched that the household staff, who had witnessed every painful stage of their story, from the burned letter, to Nora's tearful confession, to Gerald's eventual downfall, had chosen to mark this final chapter with something so simple and enduring. "Thank you, William," Edmund said, his voice thick with genuine emotion, "for this, and for everything before it. I do not know that I would have found my way back to Eleanor at all, were it not for your steady hand guiding me toward the truth when I was too blind with fear to see it myself." "It was my honor, my lord," William said simply, and returned to his place near the edge of the hall, content to watch the celebration unfold from a respectful distance. As midnight approached and the guests began to take their leave, offering warm congratulations that felt, this time, entirely genuine rather than the polite formality that had colored so much of the county's response to the original wedding, Eleanor found herself standing once more at the center of the great hall, Edmund's arm around her waist, watching the last of the candles burn low in their sconces. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "standing in this very spot 6 months ago, waiting for a dance that never came?" "I remember every detail of that night," Edmund said. "The weight of the letter in my hand, the fear that made me cruel, the sound of your voice asking me what you had done wrong. I have carried that memory with me every day since, and I will likely carry it for the rest of my life, as a reminder of exactly what fear and unexamined doubt can cost a person who loves foolishly rather than wisely." "Then let it serve that purpose," Eleanor said, turning to face him fully. "Not as a wound we continue to nurse, but as a lesson we carry forward together, proof of what we survived and what we chose, in the end, to rebuild from the wreckage of that single terrible night." "Together," Edmund agreed, and drew her into one final dance as the last of the guests departed, the great hall slowly emptying around them, until it was only the two of them left beneath the dimming candlelight, moving slowly to music only they could still hear. A husband and wife who had nearly lost everything, and had chosen, deliberately and completely, to find their way back to each other. Outside, the first stars of the spring evening had begun to appear over Camden Hall, and somewhere beyond the estate's borders, the quiet countryside settled into the peaceful stillness of a night finally free of old grief, marking the true beginning of a marriage that had been tested by deception and cruelty, and had emerged, against every difficult odd, stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. A year after the second wedding, a letter arrived at Camden Hall bearing a seal Eleanor did not recognize, and by the time she finished reading it, her hands were trembling so badly that Edmund crossed the room in alarm, certain some new disaster had found them. "It's nothing dangerous," she assured him quickly, seeing the concern on his face. "It's from Henry Colton." Edmund's expression shifted, old caution briefly returning before he mastered it. In the years since their reconciliation, Henry's name had rarely come up between them, though Eleanor knew Edmund still carried a quiet awareness of the man who had so nearly become her husband in his place. "What does he say?"
"He's married,"
Eleanor said, a genuine smile breaking across her face as she read further. "A young woman from a neighboring county, a widow with a small son. He writes that she reminds him, in some ways, of the steadiness he always valued, but that her heart, unlike mine once was, belongs to him without reservation." She felt no sting in the words, only a warm and genuine relief, and looked up to find Edmund watching her, with an expression that mixed relief of his own, with something gentler. "I am glad for him," Edmund said, and meant it fully. He deserved a wife whose heart was not still tangled with another man's mistakes. "He asks that we consider attending the wedding, if our schedule permits," Eleanor said. "He says he holds no ill will toward either of us, and would consider it a mark of true peace between us all, if we could stand as guests at his own happiness, the way he once, however briefly, hoped to stand at the center of mine." Edmund considered this carefully before answering. "I think we should go," he said finally. "It would mean a great deal, I imagine, both to him and to you, to close that chapter properly, with grace rather than awkward silence." They attended the wedding together several weeks later, a smaller, quieter affair than either of their own ceremonies had been, held in a modest country church some 20 miles from Ashwell Park. Henry greeted them both with genuine warmth, any lingering awkwardness dissolving quickly into easy conversation, and his new bride, a gentle woman named Charlotte, welcomed Eleanor with a curiosity that held no trace of jealousy or suspicion. "He speaks of you kindly," Charlotte told Eleanor privately, during a quiet moment away from the main gathering. "He says you taught him something important about the difference between comfort and true love, even though the lesson cost him some pain to learn." "I am glad some good came of it at least," Eleanor said. "I never wished to cause him harm." "I know," Charlotte said, with a knowing smile. "He knows it too. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that lead us, eventually, to exactly where we were meant to be." The wedding proved, in its own quiet way, A final closing of a wound Eleanor had not fully realized still lingered, and she returned to Camden Hall that evening feeling lighter than she had in months, grateful for a resolution that had allowed everyone involved to find their own version of happiness rather than lasting bitterness. Life at Camden Hall, in the months that followed, settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had once feared she would never know, a steady, contented partnership built on the hard lessons of their first year of marriage. Edmund's relationship with his mother continued its slow, careful mending, the older woman gradually earning back a measure of trust through small, consistent acts of genuine warmth toward her daughter-in-law rather than grand gestures meant to erase the past. Nora, the young maid whose small deception had once been so thoroughly exploited, remained in the household service, promoted eventually to a position of greater responsibility, once Eleanor recognized in her a genuine loyalty that had simply been misled by a more skillful manipulator. The two women developed over time an easy friendship that neither could have predicted in the difficult early days following the wedding night, bonded by their shared understanding of how easily good intentions could be twisted by someone determined enough to exploit them. William remained a steady presence throughout, his careful loyalty never wavering, and Edmund came increasingly to rely on his counsel not only in matters of the estate but in the quieter, more personal work of remaining the honest, trustworthy husband he had promised, on their second wedding day, to become. Word occasionally reached Camden Hall of Gerald, serving out his sentence far from the county he had once called home, and though Edmund felt no particular satisfaction in his cousin's continued punishment, he felt no inclination toward mercy either, understanding fully the scope of what Gerald's scheme had very nearly cost him. It was nearly 2 years after the second wedding, on a quiet morning in early autumn, that Eleanor found herself once again standing in the great hall at Camden Hall, though this time for a far different reason. She was carrying, she had recently confirmed, the couple's first child, and Edmund had insisted, with a tenderness that still occasionally caught her by surprise, on marking the news with a small celebration among close family and household staff. "I never imagined," she said quietly to him, as the small gathering settled into easy conversation around them, "that I would stand in this room again, feeling only happiness, with none of the old shadow from that first terrible night remaining." "Nor did I," Edmund admitted, resting his hand gently over hers. "I think, in some strange way, this room needed both of those memories, the terrible one and everything that came after it, to become truly ours, rather than simply a space we inherited from families who came before us." Eleanor smiled at this, understanding exactly what he meant. The great hall had witnessed both the worst night of her life and the beginning of its true repair, and rather than avoiding the room or trying to forget what had happened within its walls, they had chosen instead to fill it, gradually, with new memories strong enough to stand alongside the old. Margaret, present for the small celebration despite the long journey from Ashwell Park, watched her niece with quiet, profound joy, remembering the broken young woman who had arrived at her door in a wedding gown nearly 3 years earlier, certain her happiness had ended before it had ever properly begun. She thought of the long months of grief that had followed, the slow rebuilding, the painful honesty that had ultimately saved a marriage many in the county had assumed was finished beyond repair. "You have built something remarkable," Margaret told Eleanor privately, later that afternoon. "Not the easy happiness you might have found with a simpler man perhaps, but something tested and proven, which I think, in the end, may prove far more lasting." "I believe you're right," Eleanor said, resting a hand over the small, growing evidence of the family she and Edmund were building together. "I would not trade what we survived for an easier path, strange as that may sound. It taught us both, in the hardest possible way, exactly what we owed each other, and exactly what it cost to fail in that debt." As the autumn afternoon stretched into evening, the great hall filled with warm laughter, and the particular contentment of a family finally settled into the life it had once nearly lost entirely. Eleanor found herself thinking, one final time, of that terrible wedding night 3 years earlier, of the cold grip of Edmund's hand pulling her from the dance floor, of the confusion and humiliation that had followed. The memory no longer carried the sharp, immediate pain it once had. It had become instead simply the first, hardest chapter of a story that had ultimately found its way to exactly where it needed to be, proof that even the deepest betrayals, born of fear and manipulation rather than true failure of the heart, could be overcome by two people determined enough to choose honesty over pride, and love over the easy comfort of walking away. Edmund found her there, still lost in quiet reflection, and drew her gently into his arms, the same steady warmth that had carried them through every difficult season since that first terrible night. "Where did you go, just now?" he asked softly. "Nowhere far," Eleanor said, leaning into him. Just remembering how far we've come, and how grateful I am that we found our way back. As am I, Edmund said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Every single day, Eleanor, I am grateful for it. Later that evening, once the small gathering had mostly dispersed and only close family remained, Edmund's mother approached the couple with a small wooden box she had clearly been holding on to for some time, waiting for the right moment to present it. This belonged to my own mother, she said, opening the box to reveal a delicate string of pearls, aged but still beautiful in the candlelight. I had intended, once, to give it to whichever woman my son chose to marry, as a symbol of welcome into this family. I did not offer it to you at your first wedding, Eleanor, and I have regretted that omission greatly in the years since, understanding now how much that small withholding said about the doubts I carried, and never properly examined. Eleanor accepted the box carefully, moved by the gesture in a way she had not expected to be. Thank you, she said simply. I will treasure it, and perhaps, one day, pass it along to our own daughter, if we are fortunate enough to have one. I would like that very much, the older woman said, and for the first time since Eleanor had known her, the words carried no trace of reservation or careful distance, only genuine warmth. As the last of the family said their goodnights and the great hall settled into quiet, Eleanor and Edmund remained a while longer, sitting together near the dying fire, talking softly of small hopes for the child soon to join their family, and the years of life still stretching ahead of them. Do you ever think of Gerald? Eleanor asked, the question arising unexpectedly from the comfortable silence between them. Rarely, Edmund admitted. When I do, I feel less anger than I once did, and more a kind of distant sadness. He had everything a man could reasonably want: family, comfort, a name that opened doors most people never see, and he destroyed it all, chasing something that was never truly his to take. I think, in the end, his greatest punishment was not the sentence handed down by the courts, but the years he must now spend understanding exactly what his choices cost him. Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. I used to wonder whether I should feel more anger toward him myself, given everything he set in motion, but I find, most days, that I simply feel grateful the truth surfaced when it did, and that the marriage it nearly destroyed proved strong enough, in the end, to survive the attempt. As do I, Edmund said, drawing her closer against the evening chill. Every difficulty we faced taught us something we might never have learned otherwise, painful as those lessons were to endure. I would not have chosen that path if given the choice beforehand, but I cannot entirely regret where it has led us either. They sat together a while longer, watching the fire burn low, each lost in quiet reflection on the long journey that had brought them to this settled, contented place. Outside, the autumn evening had grown fully dark. Stars scattered across a clear sky above Camden Hall, and somewhere in the quiet countryside beyond the estate's borders, the world continued its steady turning, indifferent to the small, hard-won victories of two people who had once nearly lost everything, and had found, through honesty and patience and a willingness to forgive, their way back to each other. In the months that followed, as autumn gave way to winter, and the household began preparing for the arrival of their first child, Eleanor often found herself reflecting on how differently her life had unfolded from what she had imagined on that terrible wedding night 3 years earlier. She had believed in the depths of her grief and humiliation that her chance at happiness had been permanently destroyed, that she would spend the remainder of her days as a cautionary tale whispered about in the drawing rooms of the county, a bride abandoned before her first dance had even begun. Instead, she had found something far richer than the untested happiness she had once imagined marriage would bring. She had found a partnership tempered by real difficulty, honesty forged through genuine crisis rather than assumed through easy circumstance, and a husband who had learned, through the hardest possible lesson, exactly what it meant to choose trust over fear, and love over the comfortable distance of unexamined doubt. And in the great hall of Camden Hall, where a wedding dance had once been cruelly interrupted before it could begin, a marriage now stood fully and completely restored, built not on the easy certainty of untested love but on the harder, more enduring foundation of honesty, chosen deliberately, again and again, by two people who had learned, through painful experience, exactly what it cost to lose each other, and exactly what it took to find their way home.